How does the stock market work? When's the best time to buy or dump assets? And how much do you need to save every year to retire by a certain age? These are the kinds of questions that dominate discussions of personal finance. There's often something important left out of the equation, however. This is the human factor, in other words, the relationship between real people and their money. Morgan Housel argues that this factor is key to understanding financial decision-making. If you want to know why people bury themselves in debt or squander fortunes, you don't need to study interest rates. You need to delve into the all-too-human history of envy, greed, and optimism. Everyone has their own experience of the economy and money. The story of the Great Depression is well known. After a disastrous stock market crash in 1929, the global economy entered a decade of sustained decline. In the United States, the Roaring Twenties came to an abrupt halt. Businesses folded, families lost their farms and homes, and hard-earned savings disappeared into thin air. Poverty and joblessness skyrocketed, while faith that tomorrow would be better than yesterday plummeted. But it also leaves something important out of the picture. Everyone has their own experience of the economy and money. When John F. Kennedy ran for president in 1960, he was asked about his experience of the Great Depression. The Kennedys, he said, were already wealthy in 1929. And over the next 10 years, their fortune wasn't wiped out, it actually grew. By 1939, the family had more servants and lived in a bigger house than it had at the start of the decade. It was only when he went to Harvard and read about the Depression that he realized how badly many of his fellow citizens had suffered. Kennedy wanted to change that, which is partly how he convinced voters that he wasn't just an out-of-touch elitist, but a worthy president. But it's not only the rich and the poor who have contrasting experiences of economic life, we all do. For example, a wealthy individual who grew up during periods of high inflation will have a different financial worldview than a similarly wealthy person who's only ever experienced stable prices. The resulting lessons of these different perspectives shape what we do with money. We all like to think we know how the world works, but we usually only experience a small sliver of that reality. And that's the first thing to understand when it comes to the psychology of money. We know less than we'd like to think we do. When economists model financial behavior, they often rely on a convenient fiction, rational individuals who make self-interested decisions that maximize their returns. The average low-income household in the United States spends $411 on lotto tickets every year. At the same time, around 40% of all households struggle to find $400 in an emergency. Unsurprisingly, this 40% is made up of the same low-income households who spend just over $400 on lottery tickets. Playing the lottery is a long shot, but it beats the alternative, not having any shot at getting the good stuff wealthier folks take for granted. A 2006 study by economists Ulrich Malmendier and Stefan Nagel combed through 50 years of data compiled by the Survey of Consumer Finances, a long-running research project that examines what Americans do with their money. Their answer? What the economy was doing when the investors were young adults. Personal history, in other words, determines our attitude to risk. Like buying lotto tickets, this isn't the kind of rationality found in economics textbooks, but it is intuitively logical. Why are so many of us so bad at handling money? One answer is that it's pretty new in the grand scheme of things. The first currency was only issued around 600 BC, when King Alyattes of Lydia, an Iron Age kingdom in today's Turkey, minted his own coins. And that's nothing compared to more complex economic concepts. Before the Second World War, most Americans worked until they died. Life expectancy was lower back then, of course, and even then, half of all men above the age of 65 still participated in the labor market in the 1940s. Things started changing with the introduction of Social Security after World War II, but retirement remained an unattainable ideal for most American workers until the 1980s, the decade in which the average monthly Social Security check rose above $1,000, adjusted for inflation. Before that, only a privileged minority could afford to quit work in their mid-60s. That means that one of the most basic economic concepts we use in today's world is less than 2 generations old. If we're bad at financial planning and decision-making, it's not because we're crazy, it's because we're greenhorns. Luck plays a bigger role in financial successes than you might think. A couple of years back, the author asked the Nobel Prize-winning economist Robert Shiller what he'd most like to know about investing that can't be fully known. Shiller's answer: the exact role of luck in successful outcomes. Few investors and entrepreneurs would deny that it plays a role in theory, but it's hard to quantify the extent to which it's responsible for one firm prospering and another failing. As a result, we often end up ignoring the role of luck when it comes to financial decision-making. And that's a mistake. Luck plays a bigger role in financial successes than you might think. We typically either underestimate or overestimate the role of luck in outcomes. Forbes doesn't celebrate brilliant investors who went broke because they were unlucky and the market took a sudden nosedive. It does celebrate second-rate or reckless investors who got lucky and made a fortune. However, when it comes to money, we don't just need to figure out what works and what doesn't. We also need a way of building randomness into our models. We might not be able to fulfill Schiller's dream and account for the exact role of chance, but, as we'll see, we can get a handle on luck. Bill Gates once quipped that success is a lousy teacher. As Gates sees it, success tricks smart people into overlooking the role of luck, which in turn makes them think that they can't lose. Paradoxically, that's a pretty surefire way of ensuring that you do lose. Focusing on broad patterns rather than specific cases can help you make better calls. Take John D. Rockefeller, one of the most successful entrepreneurs in history. When he started building his petroleum industry, he faced a problem. The laws of the United States didn't permit him to do what he wanted to do. His solution was simple: ignore them. His disregard for legal conventions was so great, in fact, that one judge said his business behaved no better than a common thief. Looking back, it's easy to celebrate his vision and say that he refused to let outdated laws stand in the way of innovation. But what if he'd failed? Would we still think that Rockefeller's example is one we should follow? Probably not. But when you get down to it, the difference between these two outcomes is luck. A couple of different verdicts here and there, or perhaps a change in the political climate, might have altered Rockefeller's fortunes. More importantly, good luck is all but impossible to emulate. So here's the alternative. Stick to analyzing patterns of success and failure. The more common a pattern, the more likely that it's applicable to your life and financial decisions. Study after study, for example, shows that people who control the structure of their days are happier with their work than those who don't. Envy can make you reckless. Capitalism is great at two things: generating wealth and envy. To make it onto the list of America's top 10 highest-paid hedge fund managers in 2018, for example, you had to have earned at least $340 million that year. In capitalist terms, there's nothing morally wrong with envy. Rajat Gupta, born in a slum in Kolkata, India, Gupta worked his way up the corporate ladder to become the CEO of management consulting firm McKinsey. When he retired in 2007, he was worth $100 million. He could have done anything, but Gupta was envious. He wanted to be a billionaire. In 2008, Gupta, a member of the board of directors at Goldman Sachs, learned that Warren Buffett was about to invest $5 billion to keep the firm afloat during the financial crisis. 16 seconds after hearing this news on a conference call, long before it was made public, Gupta dialed the number of a hedge fund manager and bought 175,000 shares of Goldman Sachs. This was insider trading and strictly illegal. By the time prosecutors caught up with him, he'd racked up $17 million in a string of dodgy deals. It hadn't made him a billionaire, but it was enough to earn him a hefty prison sentence. The moral of this story? Envy drives bad calls, and the cost of those calls is a lot higher than the gains you stand to make. Amassing a fortune is easier than keeping hold of it. Here is an example. There were few better stock market traders in early 20th century America than Jesse Livermore. Born in 1877, he helped build Wall Street. By the age of 30, he was worth $100 million in today's dollars. Just before the crash of 1929, Livermore made the best decision of his career. He took a short position and bet that stocks would decline. Sure enough, the market lost 1/3 of its total value. While fortunes were liquidated and news spread of bankrupt investors leaping from office windows, Livermore returned home to his family with great news. He'd just made the modern equivalent of $3 billion. Happy ever after? Not quite. Remember what we said about success being a lousy teacher? Well, after his big win in 1929, Livermore thought he was untouchable. He placed larger and larger bets and lost big, again and again, until his fortune was gone. Broke and indebted, he took his own life in a Manhattan club in 1940. Getting rich, it turns out, is sometimes a lot simpler than staying rich. Keeping money is an entirely different psychological ballgame. It's about the fear that everything you've made could be taken away. He'd have been better off recognizing that luck had played its part, and that his success couldn't be repeated indefinitely. Around 40% of all publicly listed companies lose their entire value over time. And the Forbes 400 list of America's richest people has a 20% turnover per decade, excluding cases of death and intra-family transfers. So how do you keep what you already have? In a word, perseverance. As the multi-billionaire venture capitalist Michael Moritz puts it, when you're scared of losing, you look at potential wins through a different lens. You can be wrong half the time and still make a fortune. According to his own account, Heinz Berggruen didn't show much promise in his youth. When he was forced to flee Nazi Germany in 1936, he wasn't sure what to do with his life. After studying literature at the University of California, Berkeley, he worked as a journalist with a sideline in art criticism. In 1940, he bought a small watercolor by an artist called Paul Klee for $100. Fast forward to the 1990s, and Berggruen had become one of the most successful art collectors of all time. In 2000, he sold his collection to the German government for €100 million. Given that it contained a large number of Picassos, Klees, Matisses, and Braques, that figure was nowhere close to its real worth, which was estimated at $1 billion. Some acquisitions turn out to be great investments, especially if the collector holds on to them for a long time. The majority, however, are duds. Call it the long tail, the tendency of a small number of events to account for the majority of outcomes. Basically, when you get a few things right, you can afford to get more things wrong. Failure is inevitable. What really matters is the nature of your successes. So what's the best way forward? Well, accept that luck plays a role in success, learn to fear losing what you already have, and hedge your bets.